Someone asked, what was Bodhidharma's purpose in coming from the West? The master said, if he had had a purpose, he wouldn't have been able to save even himself. The questioner replied, if he had no purpose, then how did the second patriarch manage to get the Dharma? The master said, getting means not getting. If it means not getting, the questioner asked, then what do you mean by not getting? The master said, you can't seem to stop your mind from racing around everywhere seeking something. That's why the patriarch said, you fool, using your head to look for your head. You must turn your light around and shine it on yourself, not go seeking somewhere else. Then you will understand that your body-mind is no different from the ancestral teachers and the Buddhas, and that there is nothing to do. Do that, and you may speak of getting the Dharma. Fellow believers, at this time, having found it impossible to refuse, I have been addressing you, putting forth a lot of trashy talk. But make no mistake. In my view, it's not at all complicated. If you want to act, just act. If you don't want to act, then just don't. As for those who go off to live alone on a solitary peak, eating only one meal a day, or sit for a long time without lying down, or worship with circumambulations through the 6 periods, such persons are just creating karma. And if someone donates their head, eyes, marrow, and brain, or their house, wife, and child, their elephant or horse, and the 7 treasures, such persons only invite the suffering of body and mind and end up in sorrow. Better to do nothing, to be simple and direct, with nothing mixed in. Then, even the bodhisattvas who have accomplished the 10 stages of practice all search for the trace of this follower of the way, but can never find it. Good afternoon. So, continuing with the book of Rinzai. Someone asked, what was Bodhidharma's purpose in coming from the West? There are all sorts of qualities that differentiate us from the other animals. But one of the most salient qualities that we possess is our ability to tell stories. We can't help but tell stories. It's what we do. It's part of the way our mind works. It's part of the way our culture works. We pass down our history by telling stories. And of course, the stories are told mostly from the point of view of the winners. We pass down all sorts of cultural information through telling stories. And we tell stories both in words and in numbers. And the stories we tell in numbers are recounted by mathematicians and scientists, and they create our model of how the physical world works. And so this questioner, who I presume was a monk, asks Rinzai, what kind of story was Bodhidharma telling himself when he came to the West? What was his purpose? Did he think that the Chinese were dying to hear his wisdom? Did he think that he was going to bring the Dharma to the heathens? What was the story he was telling himself? What was his purpose? And the underlying question here is not so much what was Bodhidharma's purpose in coming from the West. It's what's my purpose? What's the purpose of all of this stuff we're doing? This getting up early and sitting in zazen and chanting and doing all of these things. What's going on here? What's the story behind all of this? And the master says, if he had a purpose, if he had his mind clouded by stories, he wouldn't have been able to save even himself. You've got to get past reliance on stories. The stories we tell ourselves that form our sense of who we are. Stories about how big and important we are, or how rich and poor we are. Stories about our purpose in life. These stories are important, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you. They are fundamental to our sense of our place in the world and how to act with other human beings, how to act with our children, how to interact with other animals and creatures. The stories have their place. They're very important, but they're also very dangerous. They're very dangerous because we tend to believe them and to assign them a weight and a concrete value, which makes it very hard to see things in a fresh way, to experience reality without the many layers of filter that our stories create. And so Rinzai shoots down this idea of Bodhidharma having a story attached to his coming from the West. You might substitute for Bodhidharma Nyogen Senzaki, whose weekend memorial this session is all about. What was Nyogen Senzaki's purpose in coming from the West? We think of Japan and China as the East, but that's a very Eurocentric idea. To the people of Europe who would travel across land to go to India and China, it was the Far East. But to us, it's the Far West. The West for us is the Midwest, the West Coast, and then the Pacific Ocean and everything that lies on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. So what was Nyogen Senzaki's purpose in coming from the West? And we might answer, as Rinzai did, if he had a purpose, he couldn't have established Zen here at all. He couldn't even have saved himself. If he was hung up on this story, he could have accomplished nothing. To sit in Zazen is to get beyond the story. But this doesn't really satisfy the poor monk whose question has just been shot down. The questioner replies, let me get this straight. If he had no purpose, then how did the second patriarch manage to get the Dharma? I mean, wasn't the whole point was to carry the Dharma from one place to another and hand it over? And Rinzai is just not helping at all. He says, getting means not getting. Getting means not getting. Wow. Getting means not getting. Okay. Well, let's go to the story of Bodhidharma and the second patriarch. The second patriarch, Eka. It's recounted in the koan from the Hekigan Roku, excuse me, Mumonkan, case 41. Bodhidharma's mind pacifying. Bodhidharma sat facing the wall. The second patriarch stood in the snow. He cut off his arm and presented it to Bodhidharma, crying, "My mind has no pieces yet. I beg you, Master, please pacify my mind." Bodhidharma replied, "Bring your mind here, and I'll pacify it for you." The second patriarch said, "I've searched for my mind, and I can't take hold of it." And Bodhidharma said, "Now your mind is pacified. I can't get hold of it. So getting means not getting. This, I can't take hold of it. I've looked for it. I can't find it anywhere. And you'll have to excuse me. My Inji, who happens to be me, forgot to bring me a glass of water to drink during this Dharma talk. And that's usually people's cue for moving and readjusting their position. So I'm just going to take an imaginary cup of tea right now. And if you feel like adjusting your position, please do, okay? Feels so much better. So getting means not getting. I've looked for it. I've searched for it. I can't take hold of it. Now your mind is pacified. Eka had studied for quite some time before setting off to find Bodhidharma. According to the notes in Sekida's version of the Mumonkan, he read widely in the Chinese classics and poetry. He read the Buddhist scriptures and became a monk. He visited many lecture masters and became learned in the teachings of both Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism. And he sat in silent meditation for 8 years before he had a dream in which he was instructed to go to Shorin Temple and speak to Bodhidharma. When he went to see Bodhidharma, Bodhidharma scoffed at him, saying, "The subtle and supreme teachings of the Buddhas can be pursued only by endless assiduity, doing what is hard to do and bearing what is hard to bear, continuing the practice even for kalpas. How can a man of little virtue and much self-conceit dream of achieving it? It will end only in fruitless labor." Still, he persisted. And one night, it snowed heavily. Eka stood in the snow, and at dawn, the snow was up to his knees. Bodhidharma said, "What are you doing there?" And Eka replied, "I beg you to teach me." A legend says that Eka cut off his arm and laid it before Bodhidharma to show his strong determination. And then the following dialogue ensued. "My mind has no peace as yet. I beg you, please pacify my mind. Bring your mind here and I'll pacify it for you. I've searched and searched and I can't take hold of it. There, I've pacified it for you." So getting means not getting. The master then went on to explain, you can't seem to stop your mind from racing around everywhere seeking something. this seeking something really is the stories that we tell ourselves. You know, this moment that we're having right now, this isn't it. I know there's something there that I'm supposed to be getting, and I just got to really try my best. And the story with Bodhidharma and Eka sort of suggests that that's the right approach to take. This, if I just try hard enough, if I just really push myself enough, then somehow I'll find it. And maybe that's the sort of story that we need at some point to make us draw up enough doubt and enough misery to push beyond our story. To finally give up on the story. Maybe Bodhidharma sensed that that was exactly what Eka needed. But Rinzai is not pushing that party line. He just says flat out, you can't seem to stop your mind from racing around everywhere seeking something. That's why the patriarch said, you fool, using your head to look for your head. Just turn your light around and shine it on yourself, not go seeking somewhere else. Using your head to look for your head. I've searched everywhere and I can't find my mind. There's a parable. I first encountered it in the Three Pillars of Zen, called the parable of Enyada. Enyada was a beautiful maiden who enjoyed nothing more than gazing at herself in the mirror each morning. One day, when she looked into her mirror, she found no head reflected there. Why, we don't know, but at any rate, the shock was so great that she became frantic, rushing around, demanding to know who had taken her head. Who has my head? Where's my head? I'll die if I don't find it, she cried. Though everyone told her, don't be silly. Your head is on your shoulders where it's always been. She refused to believe it. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Somebody must have taken it, she shouted, continuing her frenzied search. At length, her friends, believing her mad, dragged her home and tied her to a pillar to prevent her harming herself. Slowly, her close friends persuaded her that she had always had her head, and gradually she came to half believe it. Her subconscious mind began to accept the fact that perhaps she was deluded in thinking she'd lost her head. Maybe the story just wasn't holding up. And suddenly one of her friends gave her a terrific clout on the head. Upon which, in pain and shock, she yelled, "Ouch! That's your head." "There it is," her friend exclaimed. Immediately, Enyada saw that she had deluded herself into thinking she had lost her head, when in fact she had always had it. When this happened, she was so elated that she rushed around half mad with joy, exclaiming, "Oh, I've got it. I have my head after all. I'm so happy." It's kind of a funny story, kind of a parable for what happens to us with Zen practice, with the spiritual quest. At some point, we begin to wonder about the stories that we tell ourselves. We begin to wonder if those stories are all just make-believe. And maybe they are. And then we don't know who we are anymore. We look at the mirror and we see something reflected back to us, but it doesn't seem really to be our true self. And we wonder, what is this true self? What is this Buddha nature that people talk about? What is that? What is this mind that those ancestral teachers kept talking about? Baso and all those guys. What is that? And we tie ourselves to a pillar in the shape of a zazen cushion. And we sit, and we sit, and we sit. And when somebody walks by with the keisaku, we put our palms together in gasho and ask to be hit. All because we are looking for our mind and we can't find it. We're looking for our true nature and we can't find it. And the stories that we told no longer seem to be adequate. And yet we can't exist without them. We can't know who we are. And so there's a certain kind of desperation there. And we have our mind racing around everywhere, seeking something, as Rinzai said. Using our heads to look for our heads. And Rinzai says, just turn your light around and shine it on yourself. Don't go seeking somewhere else. Then you'll understand that your body mind is no different from Rinzai, from Bodhidharma, from Eka, from Buddha, from all the teachers, all the Buddhas. The light is shining whether we see it or not. The sun is there, whether there are clouds, whether the face of the earth is turned away. The sun of Dharma is always shining. The sun of awareness is always shining, even if we seem to have lost the thread somehow. Just shine the light on yourself. And then you can speak of getting the Dharma. Fellow believers, at this time, having found it impossible to refuse, I've been addressing you, putting forth a lot of trashy talk. I love Rinzai because he says what everybody who sits in front of listeners would really like to say. Here I am, just giving you this trashy talk. Totally unnecessary. You know, the best talk would be to put my hands together and gaosho and bow and say, let's just sit here quietly together and enjoy this. Let's enjoy this moment. It's so wonderful. Such a perfect moment. Please ignore my babble. You don't need it. I don't need it. Let's just sit here together. But we have a tradition, and the tradition is that someone has to babble, hoping that somehow the babble will shine some sort of light, even if it's just to make you look for your own light so that you can shine it yourself. Rinzai says what we all feel in our heart. Here I am because I have no other choice. Just putting forth a lot of trashy talk. But don't kid yourselves. In my view, it's really not all that complicated. You've got the Dharma. If you want to use it, use it. If you don't want to use it, don't use it. If you want to walk, walk. If you want to sit, sit. If you want to act, just act. If you don't want to act, just don't. As for those who go off to live alone on a solitary peak, eating only one meal a day, or sit for a long time without lying down, or worship with circumambulations through the 6 periods, such persons are just creating karma. It's not a bad thing to create karma, particularly. There's good karma, there's bad karma, there's karma that results in being born in the human form, which we're told is a rare and wonderful thing. So there's nothing really wrong with that. But their story the delusion that they're working under, that somehow they are coming closer to the Dharma, coming closer to their own light. That story is not very helpful. And it would be better if you didn't swallow that sort of story. And if someone donates their head, eyes, marrow, and brain, or their house, wife, and child, their elephant or horse, and the 7 treasures, such people only invite the suffering of body and mind and end up in sorrow. Better to do nothing, to be simple and direct, with nothing mixed in. Better to just drop all these stories that we tell ourselves. The story about how holy this person is or that person is, how I'm doing good deeds all over the place. And just be simple. Act when it's time to act. Put on your robe when it's time to put on your robe. Do the dishes when it's time to do the dishes. Lie down to sleep when it's time to lie down to sleep. Get up when it's time to get up. Help when it's time to help. Protect others when it's time to protect others. He's not saying that we should in any way shirk responsibility. On the contrary, he's saying people who go off on their own, who think that they're above the fray, who think that somehow living the life of a hermit is better than living in the city or in the monastery, doing what needs to be done. Those people are deluding themselves. Not that there isn't time for being on one's own. Everything in its time, everything in its place. But just do what is needed. And know in your heart what you need to be doing. And be true to that. Shine that light into your own heart. Shine that light of awareness into your own mind. Know what is needed and do it without telling stories. Then even the bodhisattvas who have accomplished the 10 stages of practice all search for the trace of this follower of the way, but can never find it. That's a really interesting statement and says a lot about what the value scale is in Zen Buddhism. We live in a time when people love to put their names on things. You know, if you go to a hospital, chances are the hospital has been named or renamed for some big donor. If you go to a wing in a museum, the wing may have the name of a large donor attached to it. We wear clothing which has the name of the manufacturer on it. And it may seem like a wonderful thing to have our name attached to things, to be known, to be famous, to be renowned. But that is exactly the opposite of what Rinzai is getting at here. If you really, really want to live in the light of Dharma, leave no trace. Do what's needed. Help when help is needed. Put on your robe, wash your bowls. Leaving no trace. The highest compliment that Rinzai can give to someone. Even the bodhisattvas who have accomplished the 10 stages of practice will search for the trace of this follower of the way, but will never find it. This is Rinzai's definition of perfection. Leaving no trace. And yet, in paradoxical fashion, because Rinzai left no trace, almost 1200 years after Rinzai departed this world, we still talk about Rinzai. Because he had nothing to do, we still talk about all of the things that he did. Because he attached no significance to talking, we still read what he said. And of course, he had nothing to do with the publishing of his words and deeds. He wrote nothing himself, as far as we know. And yet, the impression that he made on his students and the lives of those who came after was so impressive that after he died, his students pieced together his sayings, his actions, his biography, and passed them down by word of mouth, perhaps in a handwritten notebook that was passed down from person to person, perhaps from head monk to head monk, and was not published for general consumption for a couple of centuries after he died, as far as we know. The earliest copy that we have was from about 200 years after he died. And so it is. The same, of course, is true of so many great teachers and spiritual figures. Jesus Christ never wrote a thing about himself. And the earliest Gospels that we have came about at least 50 years after he died. Buddha never wrote anything down, but his teachings were passed down by word of mouth. Because stories matter. Stories are the vehicle of transmission. In our own tradition, koans have a tremendous importance because stories shine a light on our ability to comprehend the world and to transmit what we know of the world to the next generation. But don't get too hung up on your own personal story. Don't be like Enyada, looking in the mirror every day, admiring, I see this, I see that. Only to one day discover that what we thought was there wasn't really there at all. And to plunge ourselves in confusion. Take your own personal story with a grain of salt. Take your own personal opinions about yourself with a grain of salt, whether you have a high opinion of yourself or a low opinion of yourself. Best just to let that go and shine your light of awareness everywhere. And I think I've spoken for far too long. This trashy talk is now concluded.